Hi everyone. When I made my two recent videos back to back regarding the China espionage claims, I said that this is not an issue that's going to go away anytime soon. I think it's potentially a government toppling situation because it may mount to such an extent that the Labour government finds itself um, just coming under such scrutiny and pressure that it will collapse. Um, this is no small thing. We're talking about security vulnerability from a superpower. Let's try to frame that the right way. Now, the past weekend, the Eye has published extensive coverage on this story, which is good. I think it's warranted because it is a major story. Um, so we have an op-ed from Patrick Cockburn. He actually opines that they wouldn't find much. There's a picture there of Gary Oldman in the film Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which I've never actually seen. I think that's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. But also they've got a double page coverage here. Trade war looms if China embassy plan not approved. How China is tapping into the corridors of power at Westminster every day. Beijing's extraordinary grip on Britain's infrastructure, and location is close to sensitive communication lines to the city. So that's four different reports, all related to this issue of the Chinese threat. Um, I'm just going to read out some of this, not all of it, because really this is something that's going to, I think, it's not going to go away. But I'm just going to read out a little abridged part of the piece by Richard Holmes, How China is Tapping into the Corridors of Power at Westminster Every Day. On Thursday, this is the Thursday previous to this, I should say it's the 18th of October, this publication. On Thursday, the Director General of MI5, Sir Ken McCallum, expressed frustration that the case had collapsed, that's regarding the case of the two Christophers, and vowed that MI5 would never back off from the national security threat posed by China every day. A week earlier, the agency issued a rare public warning to MPs that they were being targeted by spies from China, Russia and Iran. MI5 urged politicians to keep track of odd social interactions, including frequent requests to meet privately, and to be careful if they encountered overt flattery. Interesting. It should be said the two Christophers still maintain their innocence. We believe in due process in this country, but had the trial went ahead, then these men would have had the due process anyway. So that's the irony about it. Like I said, I'm not going to read all of this out, but I'll read this part on trade war looms of China embassy plan not approved, because I think it exemplifies the bullying nature of the Chinese regime. This is a regime that if it doesn't get its own way, it lashes out and threatens. Now that in itself should be telling. That in itself should show us the sort of the nature of the what we're dealing with, and that in itself should be enough to waken the government up that we cannot trust Beijing. So this report is by Richard Holmes, Richard Vaughan and Rob Hastings. Britain risks being drawn into a trade war with China and being targeted for cyber attacks if the government fails to fulfil its commitment to approve China's plans for a new mega embassy in London. That commitment, in inverted commas, is presumably coming from the Chinese side's rhetoric. Officials have said no ruling will be made until the 10th of December, prolonging a diplomatic saga that has dragged on for more than 5 years. The delay sparked a battle of words between London and Beijing after China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian expressed strong dissatisfaction at the decision being delayed again. He urged the UK to immediately fulfil its obligations and honour its commitments, or the UK will bear all consequences. That's a blatant threat. A former UK intelligence source who advised on previous applications for the embassy said China would definitely halt work that is planned for the UK's own embassy in Beijing, threaten UK trade and launch retaliatory attacks. There will probably be implications for trade in the UK industry, the source said. They could amp up the cyber effects. The UK's diplomatic outpost in China is in need of refurbishment and lacks enough secure rooms for private conversations between officials. China has been reportedly turning off the building's water supply to increase pressure on the decision over its embassy in London. So that's how they're operating. Downing Street says it does not recognise the suggestion it gave commitments or assurances to the Chinese government regarding the embassy and refused to be drawn on what consequences the UK may now face. A senior Labour MP urged Downing Street not to be blackmailed. We can't sell our values in order to curry favour, they said. And the fact that they're anonymous shows the intimidation from Beijing. Remember, British parliamentarians have been targeted by the Chinese Communist Party. We can't sell out our values in order to curry favour, they said. With new deals opening up in the Indian, US and EU markets, we should be bold in a resolve to say the CCP can't bully us around. Dr. Sari Aryo-Havrin, a China analyst at the defence think tank Russi, says Beijing usually takes several targeted actions to retaliate. As well as imposing trade barriers, Havrin said Beijing could employ diplomatic retaliation, such as imposing visa restrictions on British officials or journalists and extending controls on British nationals or businesses in Hong Kong. She said it was likely China would beef up anti-British propaganda in Chinese state media. This will likely amplify security tensions and reinforce perceptions of China as a threat, she said. So it's a cycle. I think there's also a little bit more I want to just read out, but before I do that, I think the issue here is obvious. We're dealing with a bully. We're dealing with a bullying regime. And their attitude is give us what we want, otherwise we're going to push you around. So what Keir Starmer and his government needs to do is find some courage. There may well be retaliatory steps. There may well be implications for the British Embassy in Beijing. Quite frankly, I feel that is less of an issue than the national security threat to the UK. So if our building in Beijing is downsized, if planning work doesn't go ahead, yes, it will affect our intelligence there. But surely national security at home is the bigger priority. There may be issues for British nationals in China, and I say this with a lot of sensitivity because I've worked and lived there, and I would hate to think there was a situation where British nationals who were in trouble couldn't get consular assistance. But I would say to anyone planning to visit China, two things. On one hand, it's a wonderful country to visit. Culturally speaking, it's fascinating. Got some beautiful natural landscapes, got great food, and generally people are welcoming and friendly. But it's also run by an authoritarian dictatorship that is anti-West. You know, China likes to bleat about xenophobia. They like to whine and play the victim. The truth is, they are extremely Western phobic. They pump out anti-Western propaganda on a regular basis. They try to stoke up their diaspora. And like all bullies, the language that the Chinese regime understands is power and force. They see weakness as a green light to walk over the perceived weak party. Look at the way they push around small Pacific nations. And the UK is not a small country. We're a G7 member, we're a G20 member, and along with China, we're on the permanent UN Security Council. We're a nuclear power. We're not a small country. And yet we run the risk of China seeing us as weak. So I really think this is an opportunity for Keir Starmer to show he's a strong Prime Minister. At the moment, his opinion polling is dire. This China thing could really be an opportunity to show some assertiveness. And I think one way to do that is to cancel any planned meeting to go to China next year. And I think they should publicly, notch up the rhetoric, publicly call out Beijing's bullying, publicly condemn Beijing's threats. Not just kind of diplomatic messages about, frankly, they need to use similar rhetoric that the Chinese are using, because the only way to stand up to a bully is by using force. I'm not talking about anything reckless, but I just think it's stomach turning to think that Beijing can just push its way around and our government's just going to be okay with that or accept that. These diplomatic messages about we're going to think carefully about these decisions, and China's a complex relationship. They frankly need to be more blunt. They need to publicly say to the Chinese, what I would be thinking, the logic here is, you're threatening us. This is not the way to go about foreign policy. I would publicly accuse the Chinese of using bullying in their foreign policy strategies. And I think this government especially needs to do a lot more. I say especially because previous governments have also been, I think, too weak on China. But Starmer's government, why is it relevant now? It's relevant now because China may be even more emboldened than ever before. I mean, Xi Jinping's the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao, and China is more assertive than it's ever been before. It's more powerful than it's ever been before. Although we should also be careful there because sometimes I think there's this perception it's so powerful we just can't do anything about it. So we better just, give them what they want. I think that's also a mistake. China's powerful, but it's not absolutely unstoppable. Like all bullies, if you stand up to them, they will back down a little bit, or at the very least, know that they will not be able to just do what they want. I mean, for example, not approving of this mega embassy, Beijing will be furious. They'll probably want to take retaliatory action, but they won't have got what they wanted. And that in itself is important. If the mega embassy goes ahead, and I understand that when Angela Rayner was the minister responsible for this, she raised questions about the fact that some of the plans were blackened out, i.e., what are they planning to do with those blackened out rooms or facilities within the proposed extension of this building? The Chinese side hasn't answered that. They just frame everything as xenophobia or anti-Chinese nuisance making. That's the sort of way they frame it. So they trivialise our security concerns and they threaten when they don't get their own way. That in itself should be telling. So I don't say that the retaliatory measures are small. I'm aware that that's probably what Beijing will do, but that is still less of a problem than basically being taken for a ride. And I just think it's unforgivable for a government to show weakness in light of national security threats. That might well be the single most important thing that a government has to do alongside serving the people is look after national security. And if it fails on that, then everything else almost goes away, because if our very national security is threatened, then then the government just looks absolutely incompetent, worse than incompetent, actually putting us in danger. So this is a very serious thing. I think that the government needs to publicly condemn China's threats, publicly point out this is how China conducts foreign policy. Let them lose face. It's always about their face. What about our national pride? What about our patriotism? Starmer likes to insist that he's patriotic. Well, this is an opportunity to show it. Publicly show that this government, this country isn't going to be pushed around by a superpower. Adam Forrest writes on the areas that are compromised: Heathrow warehouses and shipping, nuclear power, national grid and green energy, electric vehicles, buses and taxis, oil and steel, Huawei, 5G and solar tech. Here's the thing, China's a threat either way. They will try to compromise the security, I think, either way. But is it not better that we at least recognise that there is a threat there rather than just letting them in with an open door? I mean, I think they're going to try it anyway. But it just seems insane to help them along the way. It just seems insane to make ourselves more vulnerable. If we put up blocks to these things, if we don't allow projects to go ahead, if we refuse the mega embassy, if we take away Confucius Institutes, etc., etc., if we make visa regulations tougher for Chinese businesses, if we take other such measures on those lines, Beijing will be angry, Beijing will retaliate, but I still say that's better than simply being pushed around and simply letting them get away with what they want. I think it's unforgivable to allow a superpower. I just, it frankly makes me sick. I mean, at a time when British MPs have been actively targeted by Beijing's wolf warrior thugs, and I think Starmer needs to call it out, but he won't because he's too cautious. I just think it's unacceptable that he could sort of treat Beijing like it's a normal player in the world stage, on the world stage. Like, we could just, I think he has this idea that, oh, we'll just get up trade and that will make relations okay. And it's the same naive approach that successive governments have taken. This idea that if we play okay with Beijing regarding trade, then the security thing will diminish. I don't think it works that way. I think the Chinese Communist Party works on might is right. They're bullies, they're thugs, and they need to be called out for it. Um, these wolf warrior diplomats need to be exposed, shamed, humiliated. Um, I think if more countries stood up to China, it would back down a little bit. China's been getting away with far too much for too long. This is not xenophobic. I'm not talking about individual Chinese people. I'm talking about the thugs who run China. They've been getting away with far too much for too long, and I'm sick of it. Um, in terms of nation states, I think China is probably actually a bigger threat than Russia in some ways. Why? Because most politicians know that Russia's a threat. Most politicians treat Putin as the dictator thug that he is. We support Ukraine. We've expelled Russian diplomats. Russia is a threat, but it's much more in the open as a threat. With China, I think they have probably implicated the country a lot more. I think infiltrated, excuse me. So when we're weighing up what's a bigger threat between Russia and China, it's kind of hard to say because both have posed a serious threat. Russia has targeted this country with chemical warfare, as we saw at Salisbury. Russian ultranationalists threaten nuclear war against Britain every day. In a way, the Russian threat is a bit more bombastic and in your face. The Chinese are a bit more subtle about it, but not too subtle. You know, they're not above showing a bit of thuggery now and again. Iran also is a threat. The only reason I don't put Iran quite on the same pedestal as Russia and China, it's simply not as big. But I still see it as an adversary, absolutely. And there'd be a few others around the world, North Korea, Venezuela, but they're not on the same scale. Who knows, perhaps in the future Israel, given the relations are pretty strained right now. But China and Russia really are pretty near the top, and if not at the very top. What are the biggest security threats facing this country? I would say, from my perspective, and I'm purely a layman here, I'm not a spy, I'm not an intelligence officer, but it's just common sense. On a nation state level, China and Russia and Iran, and from an ideological level, absolutely pan-Islamist extremism and far-right extremism. So those five things: China, Russia, Iran, pan-Islamism, and far-right extremism. I would say those are the biggest threats to this country right now. And disinformation, but disinformation, interweaves with all of those things. Um, and my deep concern is we have a government that isn't taking the security services as seriously as they should be. We have a government that's far, far too cautious. We have a government that seems to be too reluctant to offend Beijing. And that's not good enough. I want to see government ministers publicly condemning China, rather than being overtly cautious. We've had enough evidence at this point to show that China is not our friend. And like I've said before, I'm not proposing that we 100% cut off ties. We can work with them where absolutely necessary, but I think we are far too overly reliant on China. I give Starmer credit for some of his diplomacy, the attempts to reset relations with the EU. I do give him credit for that. The trade deals with India, I welcome. But I think we can do a lot more to prevent over-reliance on China, really. I give Angela Rayner credit for raising questions about those blacked out areas in the plans, but again, the government's dragging its heels. It would probably be better if they just, rather than dragging their heels, they just come out right now and say, sorry, your mega embassy isn't going ahead. Let Beijing do what it wants. And we will need to be braced for that. But like I say, if it's a choice between having implications on British interests in China versus our national security interests in the UK, the answer is obvious. It's a risk either way. I think the bigger risk is to just let the Chinese do what they want. I think they're a threat either way, but I think it's a bigger threat to just let them do what they want, rather than see them as an adversary and take appropriate action and go with the consequences of that, rather than, because then they will expose themselves. They will show that they're lashing out, and they will expose the bullies that they are.